The neighbors are shocked, and the internet is losing its mind over what happened next. But wait until you hear the cowboys' three-word answer, because it changed their lives forever. The sun was a heavy weight over the Arizona high desert, pressing down on the cracked earth until the horizon shimmered like a broken mirror. Caleb sat on his porch, his boots resting on a railing that had seen better decades. At 60 years old, his face was a map of every dry summer and freezing winter he had spent on this ranch. He was a man who lived by the clock of the seasons, waking before the birds and sleeping long after the coyotes started their nightly songs. His ranch, the Silver Creek, was a lonely place, tucked so far into the Red Rock canyons that even the mail carrier only visited once a week. To most people, it looked like a prison of dust and silence, but to Caleb, it was a sanctuary. Lately, however, the silence felt different. It felt heavy, like the air before a massive thunderstorm. Caleb gripped his tin coffee mug, his calloused fingers tracing the deep scars on his palm, reminders of a day 10 years ago that he tried his best to forget. He looked out toward the jagged peaks of the Superstition Mountains, where the shadows stayed long even at noon. Somewhere out there, he had performed a miracle, or perhaps a mistake, depending on who you asked. He had saved 3 lives in a place where the desert usually takes them. He lived a simple life now, moving cattle and mending fences, but his mind often drifted back to the faces of the 3 Apache women he had pulled from the rising black waters of a flash flood. He hadn't seen a soul on his property in 3 months, and he liked it that way. But as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, Caleb felt a strange shiver crawl down his spine. The desert was whispering today. It felt as though the past was no longer content to stay buried in the sand, and something or someone was finally coming to collect a debt he never asked to be paid. The memory of that day 10 years ago hit Caleb like a physical blow. It had started with a sky the color of a bruised plum, hanging low over the jagged canyons. The air was thick and electric, the kind of stillness that usually meant the desert was about to break. Caleb had been out on his favorite buckskin horse, trying to gather a few stray calves before the storm hit. He knew these mountains better than most men knew their own backyards, but even he was surprised by how fast the wall of water came. The sound reached him first, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through his horse's hooves. It wasn't just rain, it was a flash flood, a liquid landslide of mud, uprooted mesquite trees, and jagged boulders. As Caleb raced for higher ground, a desperate, high-pitched scream cut through the roar of the water. He pulled his reins tight, looking down into the narrowing throat of a slot canyon. There, clinging to a crumbling ledge of sandstone, were 3 Apache women. They were trapped. The water was already swirling around their waists, pulling at their clothes with the strength of 1,000 hands. They weren't screaming anymore. They were looking up, their dark eyes wide with the cold realization that the desert was claiming them. Caleb didn't hesitate. He wasn't a hero by trade, just a man who couldn't watch life go out. He unlooped the heavy lariat from his saddle horn, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of decades of practice. The wind began to howl, whipping sand into his eyes until he was nearly blind, but he felt the target in his mind. He threw the rope. The first woman caught it, and Caleb wrapped the other end around a sturdy juniper tree, using his horse to haul her up the slick, red walls. His muscles screamed as he went back for the second, then the third. The water was inches from their fingertips when he finally pulled the youngest girl over the rim. For a long moment, the 4 of them lay in the mud, gasping for air while the canyon below turned into a graveyard of rushing debris. Caleb's hands were raw and bleeding, the rope having burned deep into his palms, but as the 3 women looked at him with a silent, haunting intensity, he knew he had just changed the course of 4 lives forever. The roar of the flood eventually faded into a low, rhythmic hiss, leaving behind a world coated in thick, red silt. Caleb led the 3 women back to a small rock overhang where the rain couldn't reach them. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline, his palms a raw mess of rope burns and grit, but he didn't complain. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a flask of water and a small bundle of dried beef. He handed them over without a word, his movements slow and respectful. The women sat in a circle, their wet clothes clinging to them like second skins. The eldest sister looked at Caleb with an intensity that made him feel as though she were reading his entire life story in the lines of his face. They spoke to each other in low musical tones that Caleb couldn't understand, but the gratitude in the air was thick enough to touch. As the first light of dawn began to bleed over the canyon rim, the sisters stood up. They didn't have much to give, but the middle sister reached into a hidden pocket and pulled out a small, hand-carved stone shaped like a hawk. She pressed it into Caleb's bloody palm and closed his fingers over it. With a final lingering look, they turned and vanished into the morning mist of the mountains. Caleb watched until they were gone, never imagining that the hawk stone would stay in his pocket for the next 10 years. The morning had started like any other on the Silver Creek Ranch, with the smell of wood smoke and the rhythmic creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. Caleb was finishing his second cup of coffee, his eyes scanning the horizon for stray cattle, when he saw it, a thin, tan line of dust rising from the valley floor. At first, he thought it was just a whirlwind, a dust devil, playing tricks on his tired eyes. But the line didn't dissipate. It grew thicker and steadier, moving toward his gate with a purpose that made his pulse skip a beat. Visitors were as rare as rain in this part of the country. Caleb set his mug down on the porch railing and stood up, his hand instinctively reaching for the small, carved hawk stone he still kept in his pocket. As the vehicle drew closer, he realized it wasn't a local rancher's beat-up flatbed. It was a sleek, jet-black truck, its polished chrome catching the harsh Arizona sun like a signal mirror. It moved smoothly over the washboard road, its engine a low, powerful hum that sounded out of place in the ancient silence of the canyon. Caleb's heart began to drum against his ribs. He felt a strange sense of recognition, a prickle on the back of his neck that told him his decade of solitude was coming to an end. The truck pulled into the yard, kicking up a final cloud of grit before coming to a dead stop exactly 10 feet from his porch. The engine cut out, and for a long moment, the only sound was the tink-tink-tink of the cooling metal. The tinted windows were like dark shields, hiding whoever was inside. Caleb squared his shoulders and waited, the desert wind whipping his gray hair across his forehead. He had spent 10 years wondering if those women were even alive, and as the heavy doors finally swung open, he realized the desert was finally answering him. The doors of the black truck swung open with a synchronized heavy thud, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. 3 women stepped out into the swirling dust, their presence commanding and sharp against the backdrop of the crumbling ranch. Caleb's breath hitched in his chest. They were no longer the terrified, mud-caked girls he had dragged from the rising floodwaters. They stood tall and elegant, dressed in fine fabrics that whispered of success and power, yet they wore traditional silver and turquoise jewelry that gleamed with a deep, ancestral pride. Arya, the eldest, stepped forward first. Her eyes were exactly as he remembered, dark, piercing, and filled with a wisdom that transcended time. She walked right up to the porch steps, stopping just below where Caleb stood frozen. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of 3,650 days of unspoken history. "We told you we would find you," Arya said, her voice steady and musical, carrying the authority of someone who had conquered the world she was once nearly lost to. She didn't waste time with small talk or pleasantries. She looked at the weathered house, then back at Caleb's lonely, tired eyes. 10 years ago, you gave us our lives," she continued, her sisters Alani and Sora stepping up beside her. "We have built an empire since that day, but there has been a void at the center of it. Our tradition speaks of a bond that cannot be broken by distance or time. We did not come here to offer you money or land, Caleb." Arya took a deep breath, and her sisters nodded in unison. "We have come to offer you a place by our side. We want you to return with us to our people, to our home, and to marry into our family. We want you to be the heart of our circle, just as you were the hand that saved it." Caleb felt the world tilt. The proposal wasn't just a request, it was an invitation to a life he had never even dared to dream of. The silence that followed Arya's words was heavier than any summer heat Caleb had ever endured. He looked down at the 3 women, his throat tight and dry. For 10 years, he had defined himself by this ranch and the solitude it provided. He was the man who mended fences, the man who watched the stars alone, and the man who kept the ghosts of his past at bay by staying busy from dawn until dusk. To leave now felt like tearing a tree out by its roots. His mind raced through the reasons to say no. He was an outsider, a weathered cowboy who smelled of saddle soap and would smoke, while they stood before him like royalty. He looked at his shaking hands, the same hands that had gripped that rope until they bled. He wondered if they were offering this out of love or simply a crushing sense of debt. He didn't want to be a charity project, and the thought of leaving the only home he had left made his chest ache. But then, he looked at his small house. The paint was peeling, the porch was sagging, and the rooms inside were filled with nothing but shadows and the ticking of an old wall clock. He had spent a decade protecting his loneliness, calling it independence. As he looked into the expectant eyes of the three sisters, he realized they weren't just offering him a marriage, they were offering him a reason to belong again. The internal tug-of-war was brutal. Every instinct told him to tip his hat, thank them for the offer, and retreat back into his quiet world. Yet, as he felt the smooth surface of the hawk's stone in his pocket, he knew the desert had brought them back for a reason. The life he had built here was a fortress, but it was also a tomb. He stood at the edge of a different kind of canyon now, and this time, he was the one who needed to be saved. The desert has a way of carrying secrets on the wind, and by noon, the dust from the black truck had reached the nearest town 10 miles away. It started with a lone neighbor, a rancher named Miller, who had stopped by to return a borrowed generator. He froze at the gate when he saw the polished vehicle and the three striking women standing on Caleb's porch. He didn't stay long, but he stayed long enough to see the way they looked at the old cowboy. By sunset, the local diner was buzzing. In a town where the biggest news was usually the price of hay, the story of the hero cowboy and his mysterious visitors spread like a wildfire. Someone snapped a grainy photo from the road and posted it online. Within hours, the digital world was weighing in. Speculation ran wild. Some called it a long-lost inheritance, while others guessed it was a debt being settled from a decade ago. The internet was losing its mind over the cowboy's choice. Strangers from 3 states away were debating whether Caleb should leave his dirt-poor ranch for a life of mystery. For the first time in his life, Caleb wasn't just a lonely rancher. He was the center of a story the whole world wanted to finish. The ranch grew silent as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the desert in shades of bruised purple and deep gold. Caleb had settled the 3 women into his small guest house, insisting they rest while he cleared his head. He sat on his porch, the old wood creaking under his weight, and looked at the vast expanse of stars that had been his only companions for a decade. In his hand, he turned the hawk stone over and over. He thought about the years he had spent mending fences that led to nowhere and talking to a horse that couldn't talk back. He realized that his independence was really just a shield against the fear of being needed. The sisters weren't just offering a marriage, they were offering a purpose that stretched beyond his property lines. As a coyote howled in the distance, Caleb took a deep breath of the cool night air. The choice was no longer about the ranch. It was about whether he was brave enough to stop being a ghost. The ranch grew silent as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the desert in shades of bruised purple and deep gold. Caleb had settled the 3 women into his small guest house, insisting they rest while he cleared his head. He sat on his porch, the old wood creaking under his weight, and looked at the vast expanse of stars that had been his only companions for a decade. In his hand, he turned the hawk stone over and over. He thought about the years he had spent mending fences that led to nowhere and talking to a horse that couldn't talk back. He realized that his independence was really just a shield against the fear of being needed. The sisters weren't just offering a marriage, they were offering a purpose that stretched beyond his property lines. As a coyote howled in the distance, Caleb took a deep breath of the cool night air. The choice was no longer about the ranch. It was about whether he was brave enough to stop being a ghost. The morning sun broke over the horizon, bleeding a deep, fiery orange across the canyon walls. It was the kind of light that made everything look new, stripping away the shadows of the night. Arya, Elani, and Sora stood by their black truck, their silhouettes sharp against the waking desert. They didn't speak, they simply waited, their eyes fixed on the porch where Caleb had spent the last 10 years watching the world pass him by. Caleb stepped out of the front door. He wasn't wearing his work gloves today. He had washed his face, smoothed his gray hair, and put on his best denim jacket. He walked down the wooden steps, each creak sounding like a final goodbye to the house he had called home. He stopped just inches from Arya, the hawk stone still tucked in his palm one last time before he reached out and handed it back to her. The silence was thick with 10 years of history. Arya looked at the stone, then up at Caleb, her breath hitching as she waited for the verdict. Caleb took a slow, steady breath of the sage-scented air. He looked at the 3 women who had traveled across a decade to find him. With a faint, knowing smile, he finally spoke the words that would echo across the internet and change the desert forever, "I am ready." Caleb didn't look back as he turned the heavy iron key in the lock for the last time. He wasn't losing his ranch, He was finally outgrowing the walls of his own solitude. He climbed into the black truck, the leather seat a far cry from his worn saddle, and felt the engine hum beneath him like a new heartbeat. As they drove toward the shimmering mountains, the dust of the Silver Creek Ranch faded into a golden haze. Caleb leaned back, a family by his side and a future finally waiting for him beyond the horizon. If you were moved by the story of the hero cowboy and his life-changing choice, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story of courage and loyalty. What would you have done if you were in his boots? Tell us in the comments below.